Hi, welcome to this second clip of this week's lecture on decolonizing, question mark. You can see the question mark on your screen there. So as I always do, I want to kind of have a clip on really what I take to be the core issue or the core idea that we're discussing. And I'm going to do that by making a distinction. And the distinction that I want to make is between two clearly related and in many ways intertwined, possibly sometimes in tension with each other, ways of thinking about this demand for decolonization. One is what I would call a practical way of thinking about it, and the other one is an intellectual one, so a kind of practical imperative, as I've called it, to decolonization, demand, and an intellectual imperative to decolonization. As I say, these are related, but I don't think they're the same. So let me explain what I mean, and I'll start really with this question of the practical imperative to decolonization, which I think stems from really understanding anthropology in this case, because we're talking about decolonization of anthropology, though of course the demand for decolonization goes well beyond anthropology, as you know. Seeing anthropology, or the other fields for that matter in which decolonization is an issue, as socio-political activities in their own right. Remember, this idea goes back to the 1980s and the reflexive turn in anthropology, this realization that the very activity of anthropology is itself a socio-cultural phenomenon, just like the phenomena that anthropologists study. So to study socio-cultural phenomena is to engage in a socio-cultural phenomenon, right? So I think decolonizing as a practical kind of demand takes as its point of departure looking at anthropology as a socio-cultural, political, and indeed economic practice in its own right. And of course, the demand for decolonization is itself a socio-political practice, right? Decolonizing the curriculum, roads must fall, Black Lives Matter. These are all, if you like, social movements or social currents, perhaps. Trajectories of dynamics unfolding historically, right? So anthropology is a trajectory of dynamic unfolding historically. The demand for decolonization is itself such a dynamic. And really, the practical imperative for decolonization is a kind of requirement and a desire and a determination to shift the socio-political trajectory of anthropology or whatever other field of study is being challenged in this way, right? So it takes the form of what you might want to call forms of political activism, both within and of course beyond anthropology, and the institutions, of course, that support these activities. So the universities, the governments, and so on, that underpin, fund, organize, regulate, and so on these activities, right? So this is an act of political activism, action, to operate upon, within, and hopefully change, from the point of view of people who take this action, these socio-political arrangements, institutions, and so on, right? So there's a whole array of fields and fronts, if you like, in which these kind of demands are being made and felt. Questions of representation. What I mean here is representation in terms of the profile, the outlook, the backgrounds of the people that go into these institutional settings, both students and staff. For example, the socioeconomic and ethnic and gender and sexuality makeup of and disability makeup of staff bodies in anthropology departments in the UK and elsewhere is being challenged. That's kind of from a point of view of activism. You know, why are so many of my professors white, middle class, like myself? Is a challenge that people, students, and also staff, for that matter, are putting. Should we shift the practices of recruitment, both of students and of staff, in order to change that? How do we make anthropology or other fields more representative in that sense? How do we reform our pedagogical curriculum, right? The decolonizing curriculum. We have a conversation, a live conversation about the curriculum for this very course. Why did I make the choice to teach Radcliffe Brown's ideas, or Levi-Strauss's ideas, or Mary Douglas's ideas, and so on? Did I do that at the expense of other people's ideas that I should have foregrounded more? Those are questions that I've had to think about. You can challenge me on, you have challenged me on, we can continue to discuss. Does my own positionality as the kind of person that I am, as I said in the first clip, the kind of trajectory that I've had within anthropology, does that explain the choices that I've made? Would a person with a different trajectory, a different outlook, a different background have made different choices? All of these things are questions that are up for discussion, but also for change, right? There's this debate about whiteness, about settler colonialism and white supremacy, and the ways in which that's expressed in the very choices that I just discussed, right? Am I in some ways perpetuating or prolonging or extending those very dynamics that I'm purporting to be criticizing through the choices that I'm making about what I teach, how I teach it, and so on, right? How should I diversify the objects of my study, the kinds of topics that I discuss, right? Or that anyone discusses within anthropology? Is that another field in which decolonization needs to take place? Should we think much more carefully about the ways that we assess your work as students? Is that another conduit or avatar of colonial legacy, the ways that we assess the work, the emphasis, for example, that we give to exams and essays, which of course we are hoping very much to diversify in our department, but nevertheless, they're still there. For this exam, you're going to have to write essays, right? For this, module, you're going to have to write essays. Is that something that needs to be rethought? All of these are part of what I'm calling the practical imperative to decolonization. As it happens, I think you probably know that in our department at the moment, we're working on all of these fronts. And I personally am very much committed to that as head of the department at present, that this work is pursued with a sense of urgency, while at the same time being very conscious that when you're addressing issues that run so extremely deep, both historically and, if you like, psychologically, and of course socially and culturally, you shouldn't fool yourself that you'll be able to choose them to shift them through a kind of quick fix, a kind of quick decision to change this and that, and suddenly the world has radically been kind of made better in one fell swoop. That's not how these things work. It's going to take a long, sustained effort to shift things. And returning to what Ash said last week again, it's a project that is inherently incomplete. It's in pursuing the project that the project realizes itself. It's not in finishing the project. It's the pursuit rather than the end that matters, I think, here. All of this is really important. However, this week I will be talking about decolonization in the second sense that I mentioned. Decolonization as a question of an intellectual operation and an intellectual imperative. Let me emphasize, it's not because I think that the practical imperative is not important. Not at all. As I said, I think it is, and I'm committed to it. But this is a theory course, and I want to home in on the ways in which colonialism and decolonization might be reckoned with at the level of how we think of anthropological thinking itself. So anthropology as a form of thought, as distinct from, though related to, anthropology as a socio-political current and practice. So the practical imperative pertains to thinking of anthropology as a socio-political and economic practice and trajectory and current. The intellectual imperative pertains to thinking of anthropology as a form of thinking, a way of going about thinking. So how is this can be this be conceived as a colonial endeavor, or an endeavor that bears the marks of its colonial legacies, to put it more precisely? And in what ways might that be decolonized, to use that word, which is the current word and the one that I've given I've named this lecture after, right? So this project of the decolonization of anthropological thinking is the one that I'm interested in, and the clips that are to follow. And I'm going to use a very specific example of that project because it's an example in which I myself have been involved. I'll give you a little bit of the backstory so you know how I get to where I am. When I was doing my PhD, I had the great fortune to be taught by a visiting professor from Brazil, who was called Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. And he was a massive, mind-blowing inspiration to me personally when I went to his lectures in 1998. They've been published, you can Google them. And I got to know him very well, and he became a kind of mentor, interlocutor for me. And he was at that time and since then working out a form of reconstituting the project of anthropological thinking, with many influences on him, including Lévi-Strauss, including Marilyn Strathern, including an American anthropologist called Roy Wagner, whom he was discovering at the time, as well as we were as well. Marilyn Strathern introduced us to him. An array of post-colonial theorists, philosophers. In France, the work of Gilles Deleuze was very important for him. A whole array of influences were coming together in his thinking from the point of view of a Brazilian vantage, working in Rio de Janeiro. He was only visiting from Rio at the time. And for him, this was very much a project of furthering a kind of radical anti-colonial, decolonial agenda to rethink the whole way that we think of in anthropology, and allowing anthropology to shift the very ground on which it stands through its exposure, in his case, to thinking originating and practices originating in Amazonia, where he did his fieldwork as an anthropologist. He worked with a group called the Arawete, and wrote a famous monograph called From the Enemy's Point of View. Really his project in anthropology, which in many ways coincides, as we'll see, with the project of someone like Marilyn Strathern, was to shift the ground of anthropology by, as one might put it, Amazonianizing it, or in the case of Strathern, Melanesianizing it. What would anthropology look like if it took seriously as a point of departure Amerindian, Amazonian ways of going about life rather than Occidental European ones? For him, that was a kind of point of departure for anthropological thinking and radical self-critique and self-transformation, right? And I found that incredibly inspiring as a student, and really adopted and sought to contribute to that way of thinking, which developed within anthropology into something that came to be tagged, and I was actually, I think, involved myself in giving it that tag, the ontological turn of anthropology. I'll explain more about why that name, what that reference to ontology was made. But really, I want to use that as an example of one attempt to pursue a kind of decolonial agenda in this intellectual sense, right? And then I want to open up this to discussion about how that might sit alongside, next to, or perhaps fall short, as some people have strongly argued, of the practical agenda of shifting the ground of anthropology as a socio-political activity in its own right, right? But because I'm the person teaching you, and I have contributed, been inspired by, and have in myself sought to contribute to this line of thinking, I thought it would be appropriate for me to put my cards on the table in this way, and not least because this is a theory course, and this intervention is meant to be a theoretical intervention with anthropology, right? And it's one that's been discussed a lot, criticized a very great deal, including for not being decolonial enough, or actually for being actively reproducing some of the structures of colonialism that it pretends or purports to shift, right? So these are criticisms that I have been subject to, and which I'm completely open to discuss with you. So that's really the core agenda for this week. I'll see you in the next clip where I'll explain some of these things in more detail.